One of the things I talk about often is that instead of just moving around to burn calories, we train with intent for a specific outcome. Now, I often say that I do my conditioning every morning for my health, but I do so and I track my progress in a specific manner, and that's with wattage as opposed to heart rate. Now, when speaking to this in the past, I've addressed kind of how wattage per kilogram can be used as a proxy for a ballpark estimation of metabolic function. But what I want to talk about today is how the discerning athlete and or coach uses wattage more so than heart rate as a performance marker to drive training objectives. One of the things that you might have experienced at the beginning of your fitness journey, or maybe even still, is that when doing conditioning activities, oftentimes the speed and duration of that activity is limited by your heart rate. In other words, your heart rate becomes unsustainably high, and so you have to slow down and or stop. The thing that you will discover after training consistently enough is that eventually your heart rate increases very gradually, and then eventually kind of gets to a point where it stops increasing altogether. And while your heart rate doesn't increase further, what does increase is the buildup of lactate in your bloodstream and the fatigue that the working muscles have to endure during that activity. It becomes more of a muscle thing than it does a cardiovascular thing. And that is where the relationship between heart rate and power output come into play. So I want to talk about this today because I hit a massive PR on my 30K resisted bike. I almost got under 57 minutes. And the thing about it is, my heart rate doesn't even get to 140 BPM. Really, the only thing that ever limits me on these conditioning sessions is how hard I can make my legs work. It's a matter of muscular endurance, not cardiovascular conditioning. So, how did I get to this point? Take a look at this chart here. Now, this is a graph illustrating the relationship between the heart rate and lactate levels in the blood of a cyclist over time as their wattage, their power output, increases. What you see is a gradual linear increase in heart rate and a non-linear increase in blood lactate levels. When you extrapolate that further in an advanced athlete, what you find is that blood lactate levels cross over heart rate after a certain intensity and begin to exceed it significantly. What this should mean to you folks is if you're just training recreationally to kind of like burn some calories and, just kind of be healthy, no big deal. Heart rate's just fine. But if you are a coach or you are a serious athlete thinking about competition, or just somebody that's very goal oriented and you want to see what your body's really capable of, after a certain point, you will discover that heart rate isn't a metric that accurately determines the extent to which you've improved over time. Because the more fit you become, the less your heart rate changes as you increase the intensity of activity. Over 2 years ago, when I started this whole Zone 2 experiment, going half this speed, my heart rate was easily 20 points higher. I'd finish these conditioning sessions at, like 150 something, 160 beats per minute. Because as conditioned as my cardiovascular system has been from decades of other training, this is the longest consecutive amount of days I've done the same kind of thing in a row in my entire life. And after about a year and a half or so, like call it day 500, day 600, so like almost 2 years in, I started to notice that the limiting factor in these conditioning sessions was my legs. I at first thought that that might be something unique to me, like maybe just the issue is a programming periodization issue, or perhaps like a fatigue management issue, something like that. But having looked into this extensively, it's just a matter of adaptation. Your body will do what it's got to adjust your cardiovascular system to the activity, because if it doesn't, you'll just die. And so what we find is, at a certain point, the thing that limits your ability to progress, at least in endurance sport, is just how much lactate you can allow to build up in your blood before you're forced to quit. How deep in the pain cave can you go? And the longer I do this, being on day 838 now, I can go pretty deep in the pain cave, but then I compare my metrics to some professional endurance athletes, and it's just insane what they can put their bodies through. Why does this matter? I guess it ultimately doesn't. However, two things stand out to me here. First of all, this is a thing that I wish I knew while I was still an active duty warfighter, because I would have arranged my training a lot differently to cultivate this effect. This would have been an extremely useful attribute to develop for long movements under load, like, for instance, combat patrols. But secondly, when you track wattage as opposed to heart rate, it gives you a continual representation of your improvement or lack thereof, regardless of how advanced your fitness level becomes. The relationship between blood lactate levels and wattage doesn't ever get any better. It's just the more fit you are, the more of it you can endure. Something about the reliability of that really appeals to me, both from a scientific standpoint as well as just my nature as a human being. You can see in this graph, for instance, the difference between the before and after training metrics are proportional, just the after metric is a similar lactate level at a higher wattage. This is another one of those things, kind of like bar velocity in strength sports, where it's not necessary to track, but if you really want to get in the weeds of how to program in order to drive progress in yourself or your athletes, if you're a coach, wattage and watts per kilogram is a pretty effective tool to do it with. Consistency is a superpower. Stay in the fight.